Hello all, welcome to the show. I'm Gus Gagliardi and this is Fire Code Tech. On Fire Code Tech, we interview fire protection professionals from all different careers and backgrounds in order to provide insight and a resource for those in the field. My goal is to help you become a more informed fire protection professional. Fire Code Tech has interviews with engineers and researchers, fire marshals, and insurance professionals, and highlights topics like codes and standards, engineering systems, professional development, and trending topics in the industry. So if you're someone who wants to know more about fire protection or the fascinating stories of those who are in the field, you're in the right place. Welcome to episode 66 of Fire Code Tech. On this episode, we have Melinda Amador. Melinda is a fire and life safety professional from Canada, and in this episode, we are talking about hazardous materials. Melinda gives great tips and tricks for use and risk profiles and evaluating hazardous materials and some of the common pitfalls to look for when you're evaluating hazardous materials. We get into some fun topics like management of change and life cycle of hazardous materials, as well as Melinda's involvement in the committee for NFPA 420 and how she has been presiding over the production of this new NFPA standard. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and follow us on social media. Oh, and if you'd do me a huge favor, please go and give a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. That really helps out the podcast. Wanted to give a brief update on the show before we got into this week's episode with Melinda. I haven't been posting the last couple weeks, you all might have noticed, and I took a bit of a hiatus for the holidays and just because work was getting so busy and I was just in a learning period in my new role and I couldn't handle the production schedule. So I just wanted to give y'all a heads up in 2023. The release schedule for the episode is at minimum going to be an episode a month, and then I'm going to do my best to maybe release bonus content, but there's no guarantee on that. So I really appreciate you all for listening. I still really enjoy creating and producing the podcast, but life has just been getting busier and busier, and so I want the quality and the production of the podcast to stay where it's at or hopefully increase, but there is just a big time chunk that I have to associate with the podcast, so all that to say, thank you all for listening. I'm still going to keep creating podcasts, just not as frequently, and stay tuned for more updates. Well, hello, Miss Melinda. Welcome to Fire Code Tech. Good to speak with you today.
Hi there. Thanks so much for having me.
No problem. So I always like to get started in these interviews with telling the listeners a bit about your background and how you found fire and life safety.
Yes. That's a great starting point. So my background, I guess, originally is in chemical engineering as my undergrad, and I went through a university program that had a co-op program. So I was doing kind of internships, essentially, or co-ops with different organizations throughout my university experience, and a lot of those ended up being kind of incidentally related to fire safety. So I worked at a hobby rocket manufacturing facility. I worked in a pharmaceutical space, and I worked with um, a government branch that oversaw federal buildings for code compliance. And all of those experiences with my chemical engineering background really kind of funneled me towards fire protection and life safety. In Canada, in most of the undergraduate programs, there's not a designation for fire protection engineering. There's not a program for that. So it's really coming from kind of the core principles, where you develop an affinity or an interest in fire protection, and finding those kind of good fits in the industry post graduation. And so I ended up, upon graduating, going right into code consulting work. So doing primarily building code consulting work, but really quickly found a space where fire code consulting became my specialty and my interest. And so over the past 14 years or so, that's what I've been doing, um, focusing on fire code compliance, which I guess um, more focusing on hazardous materials and compliance strategies for kind of complex spaces, and using that chemical engineering background as my lens in reviewing those types of applications. So that's my nutshell background.
Very nice. Cool to hear. The chemical engineering, that's a really difficult degree to go through. So that's awesome that you have such a strong background in chemical safety and chemistry because, material chemistry and physical chemistry is so much of what we do in hazard determination and commodity classification. So that's an awesome
Mhm.
background to have. But I would love to hear a little bit more about some of your uh, professional roles that you've held in the industry, just like to give the listeners, I have some idea of where you're coming from, with a high level overview of engineering and consulting with the emphasis in hazardous materials, but maybe elaborate a little bit on your professional roles and kind of what those experiences and projects have looked like.
Right. Okay, that's fair. So right now, I'm a project engineer at Code Next. We're based in Toronto, in Ontario, Canada, and we provide building and fire code consulting services. Um, in terms of the types of projects that we do, and some of the kind of professional experience that I've had in that space and in prior employment. Um, I mean, some of the work that I've been doing more recently is really in the cannabis industry. In Canada, cannabis is legalized at a federal level. So in the last 5 years, we've really seen a big growth in that industry, and it's a great fit for my background in that, we really need to understand what's the process, what are the solvents being used, how are they being used, what kinds of volumes, and get a really good handle on what that risk profile looks like, because we don't have a prescriptive set of code requirements that have been developed for that industry. And so that's that's a really fun space professionally to work within, because we really get to kind of understand what are the reasons for the code requirements, what are the real hazards that we see in industry, and how are we supposed to be guiding the design team, and how can we support the authorities in evaluating these spaces that may not really fit well within the codes right now. So as a result of a lot of that work, in terms of my kind of other professional work that I'm doing right now, I'm the chair of the new NFPA 420 standard, which will be for buildings where we have cultivation and processing of cannabis product. I've also previously been very much involved in our local Society of Fire Protection Engineers um, branch in Southern Ontario. I know the Society of Fire Protection Engineers is also really well represented south of our border with with the U.S. So that was also a really great space to kind of form bonds and meet new people, and really explore and support the industry. So I know that kind of jumped around a bit, but
No, that's
that
great.
that's kind of yeah, that's kind of some of the stuff we're up to.
Yeah, I think that NFPA 420 and just the hazardous materials piece of NFPA 420 is such a relevant and current topic right now. I can speak from the state that I live in the U.S., Oklahoma, um, about, I don't remember how many years back, 2 or 3 years, had medical marijuana a bill passed through, and but there weren't any kind of legislative barriers around it for grow operations or owners, people who wanted to can't produce and manufacture cannabis products. And so it's really been like a wild, wild west in Oklahoma for a lot of these facilities popping up. And so I wanted to speak with you more while you touched on this topic of like how the building code has not just reached a place where it can address all of these hazards, where you see some of those gaps. And then also I'd love to hear about NFPA 420 and what kind of like good design principles or resources that people can look to NFPA 420 to help them in design and use that to make their building, better fire and life safety design.
Right, great. So I think what's really interesting, and this kind of is kind of a dovetail of this, hazardous materials and how it kind of plays into the cannabis industry. It's a great example of really understanding those first principles and understanding those kind of chemical characteristics of your solvents or of your process material. And in the case of cannabis extraction as our example, there were a number of solvents that were being used, and over the past 5 years, the trends of which solvents are more popular has really changed. So we might see carbon dioxide being used as an extraction solvent, or we might see something like pentane being used in a post-processing application. So, carbon dioxide, non-flammable, non-toxic gas being used under very high pressures versus something like pentane, which is a class 1A flammable liquid that, really would be very happy to be a flammable gas under the right conditions. So you've got these very different risks and these very different hazardous materials, but they're kind of, to an outsider, maybe being bundled as one industry, one risk. And so there's certainly a need to be able to dive in a bit and understand what exactly is happening, which solvents are being used, what kinds of volumes are being processed, what are we doing with our waste, and what are kind of our fundamental our fundamental fire protection and life safety measures available to us and in the code and kind of in industry as best practice. And so that methodology, that breakdown of, what are my solvents? What are my volumes? Are they being, processed under pressure or temperature differences? What are we doing with our waste? How do we have our monitoring set up for these systems? That methodology is not unique to evaluating cannabis spaces. That's a methodology we would apply to any industrial space where we encounter hazardous materials. And the hazardous materials themselves are not particularly unique. So while the industry is novel in some aspects, the solvents really are not. So it's really a matter, I think, of understanding your chemicals, understanding your hazardous materials, and looking to our codes to understand what are the prescriptive measures we have available within those types of materials and the risks they present. And then where we have those gaps, and I'll speak a bit more about the gaps, where we have those gaps, then we have the opportunity to kind of hone in, do some more risk-based assessment, do some more kind of judgment and engineered solution approaches. And when I talk about gaps, at least in the Canadian framework, the scale and the order of magnitude of solvents is a little bit outside of the prescriptive framework of our codes for fire code. So oftentimes in cannabis in particular, as our example, but we certainly see similar cases in pharma, and in food production and in oil production applications, as we see these different scales. So we have kind of a small scale benchtop laboratory space. we would have this, full-blown production bulk processing facility, and those two ends of the spectrum are really well defined in the codes. It's that space in between. It's that pilot scale or proof of concept or kind of craft scale production, again, which we see across all industries, but cannabis is a great example of that type of scale. That's where the codes kind of fall apart a bit, I would say. There's a lot of gray area. And in Canada, we don't have the same code structure around MAQ, those maximum allowable quantities. It's not as well defined. Um, it's not as clear a concept in the codes. The fundamentals are there, but you don't flip open and find your table of your MAQ for certain occupancies. So a lot of that's a little bit buried, and it's more nuanced. It's more interpretive. So I think that in terms of where we see NFPA 420 going, we would expect to find more guidelines and boundaries on certain applications that may not be well defined in the other codes. So, for flammable liquids, for example, we have NFPA 30, which has a lot of great information about flammable and combustible liquids and, our ignition source control, our fire separations, our spill control and ventilation, and all of those measures. And so the intent in NFPA 420 isn't to redigest those fundamental principles and concepts. Would be to point the user, say, hey, user, there's this other standard that really addresses flammable liquids really well. But in the cannabis industry, we see these specific applications and risks, and we're going to provide some more direction and some more guardrails around those particular industry specific scenarios.
Man, I really enjoyed that as a just a podcast listener myself. I love that explanation of, how the NFPA 420 dovetails with the other codes and standards. That's really interesting to hear about. I think it's also fascinating that you say that the MAQs and the hazardous materials process in Canada is, more nuanced and not is easy to go just to a tabular value for MAQ and kind of sort it out, because I think of that process, even though I've been through it a bunch of times, as already pretty nuanced and something that somebody who does not deal frequently with hazardous materials is going to just be overwhelmed by, with like a fairly steep learning curve, at least for the beginning, for somebody who doesn't have much chemistry background, but that's cool to hear about. So I guess I'd just like to hear a little bit more about, and this is just my personal selfish question, but like, how does the Canadian codes and standards, like, what does that process look like? I'm sure you're familiar with NFPA 400 and the IBC are pretty similar in their approach to, you know, um, find your chemical, find your volume, find your physical state, find your process, and then, analyze your control area and maximum allowable quantity. But I'm sure that the bones of it are similar, but I'd like to hear more on the codes and standards piece. And also, just one more thing that I really enjoyed about your last piece of exposition was your people who I always speak with that deal with hazardous materials for their, like, frequently and as a mainstay of their professional services. They will always think of a chemical through the life cycle of how it moves through a facility, and I always find that very interesting. You're not just talking about how it's used in the process, but how it's brought into the facility, how it's used in the process, and how it's, disposed as waste. So I think that's a great point. I just wanted to highlight it for the listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, just touching on that life cycle point once more, that it's very easy in a facility to kind of focus on, oh, there's this process, and there are these hazards, and we see these detection systems or special suppression. Let's really focus our attention here. And absolutely, that's necessary. But also, where is that material coming into the space? How is it being stored? Is it being dispensed from, a bulk container into a smaller container for use? Do we have waste products on site? We'll often have a project where a client says, "Oh, we just have this one flammable liquids cabinet in the basement." It's like, "Okay, so why? Why is it in the basement, and what are you doing with that cabinet?" Certainly, the cabinet's regulated, but there's more to it than this. So, um, it's such a big part of what we do to make sure that we're picking up all of those elements, that the owner and operator understands those responsibilities, and that it gets conveyed to the city appropriately.
Yeah, that management and change piece is
Oh,
uh, so hard and so important for that process. And really, somebody who's just designing a building from a general life safety standpoint, it's hard to get into that level of detail.
absolutely, and I know again, our codes are different, and we can talk about kind of how hazardous materials are addressed in Canada. But what I find to be a challenging component of what we do is that the fire code is an occupation standard. So it's once you occupy the building that you're really responsible for managing those hazardous materials in the appropriate volumes and spaces. But you have to make sure that the building was designed for that intended occupancy. And to what extent do you anticipate changes in those solvent uses, especially with the pandemic recently, and changes in shipping and receiving, and changes in product availability? Facilities went through massive shifts in terms of volumes of liquids that they were holding on site or that they had available, or switching to different materials due to availability. And those types of changes, that management of change, isn't necessarily getting picked up in permit applications, or getting a professional review in terms of, are you still within those original design parameters for that building or that space. And as an occupancy document, you don't get the same group of people reviewing it all of the time, right? The you're in Canada anyways, the building department and the fire department can be quite separate depending on the jurisdiction. And so what your architectural team and your design team is considering versus what your, fire inspector may be considering can be quite different. And they're not always as coordinated as we might hope. And that onus on the owner and operator to really understand their obligations and understand what the limitations of their building, and how that restricts their operations and their flexibility, I think is really critical. And that's, I think, a gap industry wide. That went off
Yeah.
on a tangent, but
No, I think it's so important because, I mean, if you can barely, you know, expect a fire and life safety professional to be able to understand hazardous materials and their implication on the facility and the process within the facility and all these factors, how can you expect, people who are working for the public and going to inspect these facilities to be basically, chemical engineers or fire protection engineers and understand all these hazards and maximum allowable quantities? I just like, it seems like almost an unreasonable expectation for these fire department guys to be. Public officials have to just be knowledgeable on so many topics. It's hard to reconcile that. So I think that's such an important topic and a very big gap. I think that anybody or many people who are in the industry would be able to opine to that same struggle of, Kelsey and I were talking about yesterday, just uh, the sadness of somebody saying, well, the AHJ said it was fine. Doesn't that mean that we're good to go? And it's like, well, no, it's not right, based on the codes and standards. And so just because they didn't catch it doesn't
Mhm.
mean that you can just, do whatever you put on the plans. So I think that's a really big problem in the industry.
I agree. I think it absolutely is. I think what my experience has been once you start to get into the hazardous materials space and more of a specialty knowledge base, let's say, the the AHJ, in my experience, will very often rely on the code consultant or engineer's report as the basis of compliance, and they'll really rely on those professional documents as their tools to assess a space and to ensure that due diligence has been undertaken appropriately. And again, that report and that evaluation may have been applicable on day one of operations. Whether or not that's really still applicable or appropriate at day 15 or year 5, or once the space has been taken over by a different tenant, like all of those things become, again, really kind of compounded as a challenge for inspectors and for owners and operators to really kind of understand what their limits are.
Yeah, that owner knowledge piece, it is such a big deal, in trying to shorten that gap between
Mhm.
what, the building owners need to know and the vast chasm of information that is all fire and life safety systems.
Right.
But I did want to ask you about, like, you know, as somebody who deals with hazardous materials fairly regularly, um, what kind of, this is like a too broad of a question, so I'll try to drill it down. But like, what kind of the process, like, how can you, or is there any like framework or system that you can think of? I know you kind of gave a broad outline for analyzing these materials, but like, I just think that documentation for hazardous materials and like the process of evaluating hazardous materials is always so nebulous and so poor. Like, you know, the, when you usually get hazardous materials documentation from an owner, it will oftentimes be, in disarray. So it falls on you to try to cobble this together, request more information time and time again, and try to document that in some way to establish MAQs and, develop a life safety strategy. So really, I'm just searching for any tips you would give from a process or a documentation standpoint as somebody who does this very frequently, because it's a monumental task, especially even if you do it like semi frequently. It's not an easy thing. So
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something we encounter frequently. I mean, usually in a project, if we know we have hazardous materials, our first question to the user is, we need your inventory. We need to understand what are the total volumes, what are the chemicals, do you have your SDS available? And then one of the items that can be more challenging is, what are the actual container sizes? Because that becomes really important. So we often rely on the end user to be able to provide that information. And, in the scale of a laboratory application, I would say that's they may they may have concerns because we have 500 different chemicals, and how can we possibly have all of that material? Or a warehouse application, again, where there's not, to exaggerate, tens of thousands of SKUs that might be going through that space, and how do we inventory that? So that first step, that inventory, can be a monumental challenge. And Sometimes there's an expectation of we'll get an email that's, here's the website for all of the SDS that we have on our site. And, that's a 40-hour effort to go through all of those SDS and really appropriately classify all of those materials. And I start that process, looking at the SDS, looking at the transportation of dangerous goods or the DOT classification, so that we can do that kind of first pass classification of, are these corrosives? Are they oxidizers? Are we looking at, flammable solids or compressed gases, what have you? And let's say that at some point you're able to obtain or generate a good inventory, where I would say a good inventory means that we know what the chemical classification is from a dangerous goods or hazardous materials standpoint. We know approximate volumes, right? Order of magnitude of volumes. Do we have 1,000 liters? Do we have 10,000 liters of this material on site, for example? And then the individual container sizes. Maybe we have 1,000 liters and it's in a single tote, or maybe we have 1,000 liters and we actually have 1,000 1-liter individual containers of a material, because those represent two very different risk profiles. So once you have that inventory, then if we're looking at the Canadian framework, I would typically, and it's different province to province. So if we talk about our national fire code, which is our model code that most provinces adopt, there's a section for the storage of dangerous goods. There's a subsection for the storage of dangerous goods. And that's really where I would start to understand what are my primary responsibilities because I have hazardous materials. And there are requirements there in terms about, your ambient ventilation conditions, some incompatibilities between dangerous goods and needing to separate those. It has some, I would say, kind of general requirements in terms of, training and placards and identification of hazards. But we need to kind of jump around. If it's a warehouse application, then there's also a section in the fire code for warehouses and piled storage or rack storage in our aisles and our access for fire department responders. If it's a laboratory application, there's a separate section for that. So we start with categorizing and doing an inventory of our hazardous materials, but then the next step is really looking at how are they being used in the space, to what degree, and finding the appropriate section of the code to address that kind of use profile, if that makes sense. We kind of have our chemical profile, and then we have our use profile. And those things combined help us to develop this compliance strategy. Except that I would say in our fire code, we might have 2 or 3 pages about the storage of compressed gases in a building. And certainly NFPA 55 for compressed gases is much more comprehensive and extensive. And so in the Canadian framework, in terms of my experience, I'm very often partnering the basic, I would say the prescriptive code requirements, then with recommendations and best practices from the applicable NFPA standard for that, either that chemical type or the use profile.
Wow, lots of great pieces of information there. Start broad with the classification of chemical, determining volume, and some of the broad factors for what's being stored. Then drill down to occupancy specific criteria and take a look at the process and use. I love what you said, the use profile and the material profile, and then also you're talking about the variance in risk for how these containers can really play. And I have been witness to the havoc of whatever 20-30 different types of container sizes, and you're like, why can't these all be in gallons or pounds? It would just make this so easy. But no, I think that's great information. I appreciate that. I understand how difficult a question that is too. That's like, just asking someone, well, how do you design a fire protection system? It's like, well, what could you give a broader question? It's like, how do you do the or the practice of hazardous materials or chemical engineering? It's like, well, there's a lot of steps in here, so it'd be better if you asked a more pointed question, but you gave a really good answer, so I appreciate that. But so I wanted to speak to you about, more about your involvement with NFPA 420 and what that professional society work looks like. What's sitting on that committee. I always like anytime I get somebody who sits on an NFPA committee to speak with them about that process and, what you enjoy about it, what people might not know about it, that sort of thing, because I think it's a really valuable piece of how our industry works. And I think that unless you're, really searching for it, it can be easy to miss out on. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, so for NFPA 420, I'm in a bit of a different role than I've been in the past on committees, and that I'm chairing that particular standard, and that it's a brand new standard. So we're really, we were lucky enough that we didn't have to start with a blank page, and NFPA provided kind of a draft outline. But from a process standpoint, and from a kind of the way that the committees are set up, it's, I think, intuitively, with the work that I've done in the cannabis sector, I was, really excited, like so excited that this new standard is coming, and that NFPA saw purpose and a need for that document. And I really honestly didn't appreciate how long of a process it is to go from not having anything to having a published document. And what I probably foolishly thought was, a year or two to get something out, it's really realistically going to be 5 or 6 years
wow,
to produce. Yeah, which is crushing. But
man,
um, but it's because there are so many opportunities for public input. There are so many opportunities and openness and receptiveness to having different stakeholders and individuals engaged in the process of developing and kind of creating some benchmarks for the industry. So I've been involved in other committees in the past as a contributing member, as a, a technical committee member, where you're really involved, week in, week out, with, focused task groups on developing code language, or, researching and evaluating, really key, minute kind of points of information and question. Um, but at the chair level, I need to take a bit of a step back from that technical contribution, and really stay focused on the overall strategy, and, you know, focusing on our end goal of getting this document put together and getting something that's suitable for at least the initial round of public comment. And so, as much as I want to sit in every meeting and be part of every task group and really get, and, into the meat of what's the right volume that we should limit the space to, or do we not need flammable gas detection in this particular application, I do need to kind of take a step back and really trust the process to all of the very qualified and exceptional committee members. We've got a very big group. I think we've got in the order of 50 to 60 members or guests that join us regularly on our meetings. And so there's a really high, no pun intended, um, energy with this group and a really high level of engagement of people that want to see this through. And but it does really need to get parceled and focused. So we may have, 50 people in a room and everybody's got an idea about how we should write something, but we really need to distill that down into groups and task groups and focus on providing, this is your scope, write this particular section, and then compiling it back together. So the role that I'm in right now is a little bit different than I've experienced in the past. It's interesting to see this side of the process where it's not necessarily as technically driven, but it's more on the organization of a standard and the nuances of what we are allowed to say and what we're allowed to reference and what we shouldn't be doing. We talk about that a fair bit. One of the biggest, I think, kind of nuanced lessons from this is also a focus on adoptability of an NFPA standard, which from the Canadian side, I didn't appreciate because we often apply NFPA standards as a guideline. It's not prescribed in our codes. Um, but I understand much better now, that different states adopt different fire codes and different, an IFC state versus an NFPA state will have different levels of adoptability of certain standards depending on the language that we use. So been a really interesting process. I absolutely encourage anybody that's interested to apply through the NFPA portals to be on various NFPA committees, but it's a long process. It's very structured, and the reason it's so structured is because they're really trying so meticulously to be fair and to allow every person an opportunity to become engaged and to speak and to be represented. But to do that, it's slower.
Man,
It yeah, it's been really great. I'm so grateful to have been able to be part of this process, but I mean, we're not gonna see the standard for a while in the public sphere.
man, that's hard to stomach. I know it's interesting for me to hear about you. I know from somebody who routinely gets into details, and engineering is a discipline of details, but it must be hard for you to try to abstain and, kind of watch the workings of this thing go forward. That sounds difficult, or try to not get down into the weeds with the process. And I think there's so much value to be gained in seeing upstream of the application of the code, after it's developed and released. There's so much value in understanding that is communicated through the process and all these things like you're talking about, adoptability, and just the way that it intermingles with the myriad of jurisdictions and forces that are involved for a committee like this. So, very cool to hear. That's exactly the kind of peek behind the curtain that I would hope to get from speaking with somebody who is really involved with this sort of thing. I keep saying that I'm going to get involved, but it just seems like I keep getting less and less time. So I don't know how that's going to happen, but really cool to hear about you in the process of NFPA 420 and kind of what you learned and the progression of that standard development. I wanted to ask specifically about what kind of professional resources you would recommend to people regarding hazardous materials. And what I mean when I ask this question is, like, are there professional societies that you like to go to learn about hazardous materials? Are there trade magazines that routinely have good articles? Or, are there online calculators or tools that you usually use for in your, routine um, workflow? But it's another really broad question, but yeah, I just would think that you'd be plugged in on some different resources with your expertise.
Yeah, I wish I could point you to like a one and done resource.
Yeah.
But it really has it's definitely, I have my own personal library of, you know, tables and resources and tools that I've kind of developed over time. So, but a few things that I have found helpful, um, certainly the professional training courses that SFPE or NFPA offer, I find really valuable. That's usually from a code standpoint, but um, I've done them a few times, focusing on dust risks or dust control or focusing on, warehouse storage applications. I think that those types of tools are really useful um, as a kind of intense learning opportunity where you really kind of focus for a few days on a topic. But when it comes into, the day in, day out, honestly, it depends on the chemical. So, one of the resources that I use often when I'm looking at compressed gases, for example, is actually the distributor manuals and the distributor cut sheets. Um, if we're looking at compressed gas cylinders, for example, the code might have a limitation based on the expanded gas volume, or it might have a limitation based on the weight of a gas. And that can be really challenging to kind of pick up off of a inventory from a client. It might be difficult for the client to pull that together. So I'm always kind of cross-checking that if I know if it's like depending on the distributor, that is providing that gas product, I can very quickly look up their cylinders. I know what their size of cylinder is. I know what that gas capacity is, and I can get very good detailed information very quickly. But that's a tool for my compressed gas related projects for a cylinder warehouse, for example. Um, if we're looking at flammable liquids, honestly, and I don't know if there's a lot of chemi type folk that are kind of engaged in this podcast, but like Perry's Chemical Handbook, I still use on a regular basis to pull up, evaporation rates and vapor pressures and chemical characteristics if I'm looking at an explosive concentration of flammable vapors in an evaluation. Um,
Mm.
so it's chemical specific, and each set of chemicals has really useful resources that are coming either from the professional organizations or from kind of the first principles engineering literature, or from the manufacturers and distributors of these materials. Um,
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go on. I didn't mean to interrupt
no,
you.
no,
Just
that's
trying to
fair.
say that's awesome.
Yeah, the last component that really impacts on hazardous materials is the process equipment. And again, we've been so lucky to be able to work either directly with equipment developers and suppliers to understand what those process applications look like. Um, but a lot of it is relying on, yeah, I don't know. I can't really point you to a best a best use. It depends on the industry, it depends on the chemical. Um, and I've got a great library in my computer that I don't know how to share with the world.
No, that's fair. I mean, I think that most, people who are in the industry long enough have their, list of Excel sheets and references cobbled together in a file on their, desktop on the, right when they open their computer, their little personal files. So, no, but I think that your information about how it's very material specific, while that might seem, or I don't know if it seems intuitive to you or not, but it's not intuitive to me. And so that's a really good tip that I want people to take away is that, when you're thinking of trying to extrapolate information for hazardous materials, drill down to specific chemicals and distributors, manufacturers, professional societies centered around that specific chemical, NFPA standards centered around that specific chemicals. And also, I'll drop a link to that Perry's Chemical Engineers Handbook. So if people want to pick that up, that they can do that, because that looks interesting and probably something good to have on the shelf for, because I know that it can, any good resources, it's good to have, even if it's a textbook that you're like, I don't know if this is still applicable. But I think that the more info that you can have when you run into something like this, for your personal library, is a good deal.
Absolutely. I collect old texts when I can. I think they're so
Oh man,
valuable.
that's awesome. I follow this guy on LinkedIn who collects all the old versions of the building codes. Like, he's a real hobbyist, and he'll post about anytime he gets like a 50 or plus year old code book, he'll post from his library and do little TikToks and stuff.
That's amazing. I
Yeah.
appreciate that so much.
Yeah. It's a level of fire safety and hobbyist eccentricity that I can get behind as well. But yeah, I think that those were all such good tips and resources. I guess just my last question is, what do you see going on as the industry as a big trend? I know that you're probably well engaged with NFPA 420 cannabis facilities and whatnot, but just broadly, is there anything that you're seeing in what's going on now in fire and life safety, or in the consulting industry?
Right. I think there's certainly a lot of discussion and review of lithium ion batteries. That's kind of the big topic from a hazardous materials standpoint in terms of storage, in terms of recycling facilities. Um, those devices are pretty unique because they have a chemical potential and risk, but also an energetic potential and risk. So it's a bit unusual. And, I think there's certainly a lot of ongoing discussion about that. I'm hoping, um, we get more clarity and direction on those types of facilities as the industry grows to support it. I think that's one of the really critical things when we have new technology and when we have new industries and we're trying to play catch up from a code standpoint. We need to kind of have a bit of an open mind when we're evaluating these spaces and helping these spaces to develop, um, to respect the code and respect the framework, but really, address the risk, qualify and quantify that risk and design appropriately when we don't have a code and trust that the code will come in time, but those industries still need the flexibility and the space to operate in a safe way.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting. We just had a terrible hurricane that hit Florida, and there was a bunch of flooding, and people were talking about the electric or alternative fuel vehicles, like having failures after being in that sort of an environment, flooded, and just kind of getting damaged, mechanical or otherwise, and just kind of spontaneously combusting because of
Right.
degradation. So that, combined with, I know recently I've seen um, big metropolitan areas in the U.S. like New York City talking about how they don't really have as many resources as they need to deal with these electric or alternative fuel vehicle fires. So I think that that's a good point, that there's a big um, that hazard needs to be addressed better. So I think that's a good point you bring up.
Yeah, yeah, and just to kind of circle back to one of our earlier points on this, it's that life cycle question. We look at the technology and we say, okay, this is great inside of a vehicle, but how are we storing the batteries in bulk? How are we addressing the waste? How are we addressing recycling? Right? It's that whole piece. that needs to be looked at as an industry and as a life safety industry to address all of those different uses of that one product.
Yeah, those waste and recycling fires seem like more common than any other building facility type that I've seen. I mean, I don't have any data, that's all anecdotal, but the number of uh, fires in waste and recycling facilities that you see online, it's pretty
Mhm.
remarkable.
Yeah.
Um, but anyways, well, that's all I got for you, Miss Melinda. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Unless you have any questions or other things you'd like to discuss, I really enjoyed our conversation. And yeah, I just want to say thanks.
Well, thank you, Gus, so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thanks for listening, everybody. Be sure to share the episode with a friend if you enjoyed it. Don't forget that fire protection and life safety is serious business. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are by no means a professional consultation or a codes and standards interpretation. Be sure to contact a licensed professional if you are getting involved with fire protection and or life safety. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.